back to the two peasants. They were already on the cart, whipping the horses. We passed the station building. On the way, the soldier stopped at a warehouse, where he was handed a small can of gasoline. Then we walked along the railroad track toward the looming forest. I knew the soldiers had orders to shoot me, pour the gasoline over my body, and burn me. I had seen this happen many times. I remembered how the partisans had shot a peasant who had been accused of being an informer. In that case, the victim was ordered to dig a ditch into which his dead body later dropped. I remembered the Germans shooting a wounded partisan who was fleeing into the forest, and a tall flame rising later over his dead body. I dreaded pain. The shooting would certainly be very painful, and the burning with the gasoline even more. But I could do nothing. The soldier carried a rifle, and the rope tied to my leg was looped over his wrist. I was barefoot, and the cross ties were hot from the sun and scorched my feet. I hopped about on the sharp particles of gravel lying between the cross ties. I tried several times to walk on the rail, but the rope tied to my legs somehow prevented me from keeping my balance. It was difficult to adjust my small steps to the large, measured stride of the soldier. He watched me and smiled faintly at my attempt at acrobatics on the rail. The smile was too brief to signify anything. He was going to kill me. We had already left the station area and now passed the last switch point. It was darkening. We drew nearer to the forest, and the sun was setting beside the treetops. The soldier halted, put down the gasoline can, and transferred the rifle to his left arm. He sat down at the edge of the track, and heaving a deep sigh, stretched his legs down the embankment. He calmly took off his spectacles, wiped the sweat from his thick brows with his sleeve, and unclipped the small shovel hanging from his belt. He took out a cigarette from the breast pocket and lit it, carefully extinguishing the match. Silently he watched my attempt to loosen the rope, which was rubbing the skin off my leg. Then he took a small jackknife out of his trouser pocket, opened it, and moving closer, held my leg with one hand and with the other carefully cut the rope. He rolled it up and flung it over the embankment with a sweeping gesture. I smiled in an attempt to express my gratitude, but he did not smile back. We now sat, he drawing at a cigarette, and I observing the bluish smoke drifting upward in loops. I began to think of the many ways that there were of dying. Until now, only 2 ways had impressed me. I recalled well the time, in the first days of the war, when a bomb hit a house across the street from my parents' home. Our windows were blown out. We were assaulted by falling walls, the tremor of the shaken earth, and screams of unknown dying people. I saw the brown surface of the doors, ceilings, walls, with the pictures still clinging desperately to them, all falling into the void. Like an avalanche rushing to the street came majestic, grand pianos, opening and closing their lids in flight, obese, clumsy armchairs, skittering stools and hassocks. They were chased by chandeliers that were falling apart with shrill cries, by polished kitchen pots, kettles, and sparkling aluminum chamber pots. Pages torn out of the gutted books fell down, flapping like flocks of scared birds. Bathtubs tore themselves away slowly and deliberately from their pipes, intertwining themselves majestically in the knots and scrolls of banisters and railing the rained gutters. As the dust settled, the split house timidly bared its entrails. Limp human bodies lay tossed over the jagged edge of the broken floors, and ceilings like rags covered the brick. They were just beginning to soak in the red dye. Tiny particles of torn paper, plaster, and paint clung to the sticky red rags like hungry flies. Everything around was still in motion. Only the bodies seemed relaxed and at peace. Then came the groans and screams of people pinned down by the falling beams, impaled on rods and pipes, partially torn and crushed under chunks of walls. Only one woman came up from the dark pit. She clutched desperately at bricks, and when her toothless mouth opened to speak, she was suddenly unable to utter a sound. She was half naked, and withered breast hung from her bony chest. When she reached the end of the crater, at the pile of rubble between the pit and the road, she stood up straight for a moment on the ridge. Then she toppled over backwards and disappeared behind the debris. One could die less spectacularly at the hands of another man. Not long ago, when I lived at Likas, 2 peasants began to fight at a reception. It was the middle of the hut, and they rushed each other, clutched at each other's throats, and fell on the dirt floor. They bit with their teeth like enraged dogs, tearing off pieces of clothing and flesh. Their horny hands and knees and shoulders and feet seemed to have a life of their own. They jumped about clutching, striking, scratching, twisting in a wild dance. Bare knuckles hit skulls like hammers, and bones cracked under the stress. Then the guest, watching calmly in the circle, heard a crushing noise and a horse rattle. One of the men stayed on the top longer. The other wheezed and seemed to be wakening, but still lifted his head and spat at the victor's face. The man on top did not forgive this. He triumphantly blew himself like a bullfrog and took a wide swing, smashing the other's head with a terrible force. The head did not struggle to rise any more, but seemed to dissolve into a growing pool of blood. The man was dead. I felt now like a mangy dog that the partisans had killed. They had first stroked his head and scratched him behind his ears. The dog, overwhelmed with joy, yapped with love and gratitude. Then they tossed him a bone. He ran after it, wagging his scruffy tail, scaring the butterflies and trampling flowers. When he seized the bone and proudly lifted it, they shot him. The soldiers hitched up his belt. The movement caught my attention, and I stopped thinking for a moment. Then I tried to calculate the distance to the forest, and the time it would take him to pick up his rifle and shoot it, if I should suddenly make a break for it. The forest was too far. I would die midway on the sandy ridge. At best, I might reach the patch of high weeds, in which I would still be visible and unable to run fast. The soldier rose and stretched with a groan. Silence surrounded us. The soft wind blew away the smell of the gasoline and brought back the fragrance of marjoram and fir resin. He could, of course, shoot me from the back. I thought people prefer killing a person without looking into his eyes. The soldier turned toward me and, pointing to the forest, made a gesture with his hand, which seemed to say, "Run away! Be off!" So the end was coming. I pretended I did not understand and approached him. He moved back violently, as if fearing that I might touch him, and angrily pointed to the forest, shielding his eyes with his other hand. I thought that this was a clever way of tricking me. He was pretending not to look. I stood rooted in the spot. He glanced at me impatiently and said something in his rough tongue. I smiled fawningly at him, but that only exasperated him more. Again he thrust his arm towards the forest. Again I did not move. Then he lay down between the rails, across his rifle, from which he had removed the bolt. I calculated the distance once more. It seemed to me that this time the risk was small. As I began to move away, the soldier smiled affably for the first time. When I reached the end of the embankment, I glanced back. He was still lying motionless, dozing in the warm sun. I hastily waved, and then leapt like a hare down the embankment straight to the undergrowth of the cool, shady forest. I tore my skin against the ferns as I fled further and further until I finally lost my breath and fell down the moist, soothing moss. While I lay listening to the sounds of the forest, I heard 2 shots from the direction of the railroad track. Apparently, the soldier was simulating my execution. Birds awakened and began rustling in their foliage. Right next to me, a small lizard leapt out of a root and stared attentively at me. I could have squashed it with a whack of my hand, but I was too tired.